Thank you. Hey, good morning, Village Church. Good to see you. Good to be with you. Nona said, we'd love to meet you if we've not met. We try to hang out over here just for that purpose, to say hello. And so welcome if you are new. My name's Kevin, one of the elders here, lead pastor. And just wanted to, before we dive in today, if you are a parent of a village kid that, I don't know if you probably know this already, school's about to start back. Like, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, something like that. Summer has gone quickly. And so next week, August 11th, is what we call Move Up Sunday. So if you have a child in Village Kids that's changing from one class to another because of a grade change, that's going to happen next week. And so I want to make sure you're prepared for that. I know that Michelle has been communicating that, but I wanted to say it. And mostly, I wanted to do it here because I wanted to take the opportunity to thank all of you who serve our next generation leaders. Those of you who serve in Village Kids, the street crew, landing, just how critically important it is for us as a church as we talk about loving God, loving others, and making disciples. A huge part of making disciples is us discipling our children and our students. And to do that, we need disciples to disciple others. And so for those of you who give tirelessly, many of them won't hear it because they're down there right now serving in children's ministry. I just want to say thank you for giving selflessly to do that. Many of you, not just on Sunday morning, but of course we've got our Wednesday night, it's called The Landing. That's our CR for teens. Many of you serve there. And of course Thursday night we've got the Street Crew, which is our outreach to the kids here, students here in the community. Several of you serve in that area. And so I just wanted to say thank you. God sees you. I know it's tough work. Some of these kids we serve are tough. I don't mean your kid. I mean somebody else's kid is tough. And so God's given us a special opportunity here to love on, invest in those children, because we see, I say it all the time here, a long game for us as a church to be here to serve those that are in the church, because we believe strongly in making certain we pass on a heritage of faith to our children, and to many that have not grown up in that heritage of faith, that we would give them the opportunity to be the first. Many of you are the first in your family to begin that heritage of faith. You're leading your children in that, and many of the kids we're serving, that same thing is true. And so if you are doing that, thank you. And I would be remiss, Michelle would certainly get on me if I didn't take the opportunity to say, if you're not serving, boy, we need you. It is such a critically important ministry in all of those areas I'm talking about. If you're not serving in one of those areas, we'd love to talk to you about it because it's really important. Most of it's just once a month, so it's not a huge commitment, but boy, it's a huge impact. So if you're interested in serving, see me, talk to Michelle, talk to Daryl. We'd love to get you connected that way. So thank you. So we're going to continue on in our summer book series. This is a series we're doing over the summer as we wind up summer. It's August 4th. You believe that? What happened to June and July? And each week we're doing something you should never do, and that is we cover an entire book of the Bible in just 30 minutes. And so do not do this at home. We are trained professionals. I'm just kidding. What we're trying to do is cover one of these books in the Bible to just kind of give you a taste, to get you started. The idea is to familiarize you, to all of us, remind us, for those of us that have certainly read some of these books, about what that book is, what it has to say, and then also find something there that speaks to us today. I think it's really important for us to understand the Scriptures and the time and place they were written, and it's just as important to say, God's speaking to me today through His Word. How is it that I find those nuggets of wisdom, the leading from the Lord, where the Spirit would prompt me? And so it takes an effort to do that, and so that's what we're doing. So far, we've covered the books of 1 John, Joshua, 2 Peter, Hosea, Nehemiah. You can see it's been a pretty eclectic group, both Old and New Testament. Today I'm going to cover the book of Ruth. So I've kind of gotten in a Old Testament lane. I did Galatians last week, so not completely Old Testament. Just to kind of forecast it, next week we're going to do Romans, Kyle's going to come and teach on Romans. The week after that, we're going to do the book of Philippians. Carol Wynn's going to teach on the book of Philippians. And so 2 really good letters from the Apostle Paul that we're going to be looking at. And so I encourage you to keep coming back. We're going to continue this on probably at least through the month of August. And so I'm having fun. I hope you're enjoying it. And I hope, again, that each Sunday you're moving beyond just what we're talking about and then heading deeper into that particular book. This week's book is easy. It's only 4 chapters. You can read the book of Ruth in about 15 minutes, depending on how quickly you read, and it is rich. It is a beautiful story. It's it's my favorite book of the Bible this week. I love the book of Ruth. I think you'll find it's got some great history and some great application. And so let's do the 5 W's. This is our practice here. The who, what, when, where, and why. The who, and when we talk about the who, we mean, who wrote it, but also we want to say who's it to or who's in it kind of a thing. The who wrote it on the book of Ruth is not absolutely known. The author does not say, hey, this is so-and-so. Most scholars believe it's Samuel, but that's not certain. Samuel is the one that most would presume has written the book of Ruth. The who, in terms of who it's about, it's a lot about lots of folks, but there are 3, I don't want to call them characters because this really happened. It's not a made-up story, but there are 3 characters in this story that we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about Ruth, who the book is named after. We're going to talk about her mother-in-law, Naomi, and we're going to talk about a man named Boaz. So Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz are going to be the center of who it is we're looking at today. What is the book of Ruth? Again, this is genre. Is it a book of the law? Is it a book of wisdom? Is it a prophetic book? Is it a gospel? Is it a letter or an epistle? It is actually a historical book. Historical book like Joshua. Remember I covered Joshua, Nehemiah, talked about Nehemiah, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Samuel, Ezra, Nehemiah. These are all historical books, and they're historical because they tell the history of the nation of Israel. So lots of events that get told in those stories, lots of lists of names and families. Today, it ends in one of those lists of families at the end of Ruth, but it's historical. So if you're like me and you love history, and I do, it has that extra added interest to it because I love to hear the details of how this story, because it involves some very real, very average people. The when of this is at the beginning of the book, the writer says, at the time of the judges. At the time of the judges, and I won't get too deep into it, but the time of the judges in the history of Israel would have been after Moses, after Joshua, but before you get to the time of the kings, or what we call the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom would have been Saul and David and Solomon, and then we went into the divided kingdom. In between there is this time of judges, where the children of Israel would say, hey, God, we want a king. All of our neighbors have kings. Can we have a king too? And God said, no, I'm your king. But what I will do is I'll appoint judges. And these judges were there to make sure that the law was upheld, to facilitate the ways of the Lord within that community, to actually settle disputes. And so you've got judges like, you've heard the story of Gideon. Deborah was a judge. Samson was a judge. There were several, I think 12 or 13. And so the when falls somewhere between 1200 BC and 1000 or 1050 BC. So about 1,000 years, 1,200 years before Christ was born was when this actual story, when this book was written and when all this happened. So that's the when. The where is really important to this book. The where is really the kind of the foundation of the problem. Every good story has a problem, right? And so the where of this story, we're going to find out, starts in Bethlehem. Y'all know Bethlehem, that's where Jesus was born. So this is in Judah, in the town of Bethlehem. But it also involves a country, an area called Moab. Moab is what we now know today as current-day Jordan. So it would have been east of Israel. And these were some of the, not the only, the arch rivals, the enemies, the hated people of the Jews. These are the people that were pagan in their culture. They had all kinds of awful pagan ways of worship. They worshiped several gods. It was really, really prominent within their culture to use child sacrifice as one of their ways of worshiping. And so when you think about the religion of the Jews, this Yahweh, I'm the Lord your God, you'll have no other gods. There's one God, one true God. And you contrast that to the gods of the Moabites. You're talking about big deals. And so for these reasons that we've seen throughout the history of Israel, it's been God's intent to keep his people, because the salvation of the world will come from his chosen people, but an important part of that is that they stay true to him. Don't go off intermarrying with people that are going to change who you are, take you off in other places. And we see in the history of Israel time and time and time again, they continue to do that. But this lane was always about God saying, I'm your God. I'm it. I'm all you need. You don't need all those other gods. I'm the one true God. And the Moabites would have been one that would have certainly had a different view of it. The why, hold on to that. We'll come back to it. So here's the story. It involves all of what we just talked about. So the story starts in Bethlehem, and a famine strikes that area. And so, of course, a famine in that time, because most of the people either made their living and certainly relied on their place for food, for crops to grow. And so we don't know the length or the effects of what it was in totality, but it's happened oftentimes in the ancient world. Famine came, and it caused a tremendous problem amongst the children of Israel. And so in Bethlehem, things were having a big problem. There was a man named Elimelech who was Naomi's husband. And at this difficult time, this Jewish man decided, because there's famine here, I've got to leave. Things are tough here in Bethlehem, so I'm going to leave. And he doesn't stay within the community of faith. He leaves and goes to Moab. He goes to Moab. They have 2 sons. While they're there, Elimelech dies, leaving Naomi a widow. Her sons marry 2 Moab women, a lady named Orpah and a lady named Ruth, who we're going to talk about. Then her 2 sons died. So now you have Naomi, you have Orpah, and you have Ruth. You have 3 women that are widowed, 1 Israeli, 2 Moab women. They're vulnerable. This is a big problem in this ancient world, that protection and provision is provided mostly by your husband. Your family lineage, your assets, all of that is because that you are a woman with assets connected to your family. And remember, Elimelech, when things got tough, he left. So here's Naomi sitting in a foreign land with foreign daughter-in-laws, and she says, I'm vulnerable. I've got to do something. I've got to go back. And so she says to her 2 daughters-in-laws that have now lost their husbands too, I'm going back to my people. I'm going back to Bethlehem. You need to go back to your people. You go back to your pagan ways. You go back to your culture. You go back to the gods you know. Her one daughter-in-law, Orpah, takes her up on it and says, okay, you're right. I need to go find a husband here in my place, and I'm going to go do that. Ruth, on the other hand, chooses to not do that. She instead chooses to stay with Naomi. And in Ruth 1, verse 16, this will be on your screen, we see this conversation with Ruth to Naomi. She says this, but Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. And where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I'll be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates you and me. And so we see this kind of an unexpected loyalty from a Moab woman to a Jewish mother-in-law, who was probably the safer thing to do would have been certainly to go back to her people and find a husband, and at least that way she would be protected and provided for. But instead, she chooses to stay with Naomi and go back to a place and a culture where she knew she's likely going to be hated. Like the Jews would not necessarily treat a person of foreign birth well, certainly not one of their arch rivals. But because of the loyalty and the commitment that she felt towards Naomi, and I believe because she says, may the Lord deal with me, I see evidence there of a recognition that she knows that those other gods are not gods. That my future is in the one true God, and I have a loyalty and a commitment to you, and I know that it's going to cost me personally, but still, I'll do that. So Naomi and Ruth head back to Bethlehem, and again, they have no means, they have no way of taking care of themselves. They're completely dependent on the generosity of others. And so Naomi, because she's older, sends Ruth to try to find food for them. And so Ruth finds herself in a field of a very wealthy man, a guy named Boaz, who's allowing people that are poor and that are foreigners to come in and take part of the harvest. He's allowing them to take part of what he owns because he knows that they might need it. And so there he meets Ruth. And the two of these two come together, and in Ruth 2, verse 11, we see this first interaction. Boaz replied, I've been told about what you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you left your father and mother and your homeland and came to live with the people you do not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you've done. May you be richly rewarded from the God of Israel. Under those wings you have come to take refuge. And so Boaz takes notice of this woman, even though she's a foreigner, and her reputation has always gone ahead of her because he's heard that she's doing this exceptional thing. And in fact, he says to his workers around her, don't touch her. Don't mess with her. She's under my protection, because a single woman of that age would have been vulnerable to all kinds of abuse and attack. And Boaz says, no, you can't do that. She's falling under my protection. Ruth goes back and tells Naomi about having met this man that she had never met before. And Naomi says, wait a minute, there's something good happening here. Boaz is our kinsman redeemer, or our guardian redeemer. Boaz is the closest relative that has the ability to restore everything that I have lost. And what a kinsman redeemer is, and I just want to kind of share with this quickly, this is an important thing, because in the Jewish culture, of course, if a brother dies, then it would be his closest relative, which is his other brother, that has a responsibility to come in and protect his family. Likewise, a kinsman redeemer, if not a brother, has the responsibility in that time to do really three things. A kinsman redeemer will always avenge any injustice towards a family member. So, if I were killed, my kinsman redeemer would be responsible to go and avenge, bring justice for the person that had killed me. The kinsman redeemer was also responsible for the reclamation of property. So if I fell on hard times, my property then was mortgaged or fell into hands of someone else, if I went into debt, the kinsman redeemer was responsible to buy that property back. Remember, land was identity. The possession of land was my future, something that was passed to me and I would pass on to my family. And without that inheritance, I had nothing to give my children. So if I mortgaged it and lost it in difficult economic times, like in famine, my family would lose its inheritance. So the kinsman redeemer was responsible for that. And the third thing is the kinsman redeemer was responsible for the lineage of that family, because it would do the family no good to have a land but then have no heirs. And so the kinsman redeemer, in this case, if we talk about a brother, it was his responsibility to take that woman as a wife and provide for her an heir. So to avenge and to bring justice, to reclaim property, and then also to move on the lineage. None of these things were available to Naomi and Ruth. And of course, Naomi was an older woman. She's just looking to, at best, hopefully survive until a natural death. Ruth is a young woman. She has a future. She has other options. She's got other things she can do. And frankly, because she's not part of this family, but only by marriage, she doesn't have the obligation to make sure this family gets restored in the way that the law would require it. But she does take responsibility. She does see that as part of her future. And so she does a very dangerous thing, a very bold thing. She goes back to Boaz in a way that I won't go through all the cultural implications of it, but lays herself at his feet. It is really literally a proposal of marriage for this young woman to this older, wealthy landowner. And then you hear this discussion in Ruth 3 between Boaz and Ruth. This is Boaz speaking. "Who are you?" he asked. "I'm your servant Ruth," she said. "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer or kinsman redeemer of our family." "The Lord bless you, my daughter," he replied. "This kindness is greater than that which was showed you earlier. You've not run after the younger men, whether rich or poor. And now, my daughter, don't be afraid. I will do for all you ask. All the people of my town know that you are a woman of noble character." And so we see Ruth willing to set aside her future. Now, this would have helped her future. We can't miss that. But she put the future of her family or her adopted family first by putting herself in a position where the kinsman redeemer would then be able to work his responsibilities through her. Lots of details we won't go into today. Actually, Boaz was not the first one in line. There was another kinsman redeemer. And so that next morning, he wakes up and he goes back to the town, and he says to that kinsman redeemer, here's an opportunity. That kinsman redeemer says, okay, I'll buy back the land. And Boaz says, well, if you get the land, you got to take the girl too. Wait a minute, I don't want the girl and the land, so never mind, you do it. And his concern was adding an heir to his family would split the inheritance. It would actually create problems within his family. It was an easier thing for him, even though he was responsible to do the right thing, to say, no, go ahead. And probably easier because Boaz said, if you don't, I will. I'll take the responsibility. I'll buy back the land. I will take her on as someone that I become responsible for. So we see in that a commitment from Boaz. So before we go on with the story, I want to pause for a few minutes here and just think about the lessons from these three characters that we've met so far. Well, what is it that we are learning about them, and frankly, we can learn from ourselves, about Naomi and about Boaz and about Ruth? Well, from Naomi, she's kind of a tragic figure, right? Because you got to recall that what's going on in Naomi's story is that her husband was disobedient. Her husband was unfaithful, not to her and her marriage, but to the ways of the Lord, and that when things got tough, when famine hit, he just picked up and left. The right thing to do would be to stay in your land to where you're at and then persevere. Make sure your inheritance and that your future and that your children's future was still bound. But he didn't do that. He picked up and he left. Naomi really didn't have a say in that time and culture. She would have certainly just been a consequence of that. We see also that her sons, I'm reading this into a little bit, her sons had an opportunity after their father died to say, you know what, now's a good time. Let's take my wives, we'll all go back. They chose not to do that. They stayed there and they died. Again, more men letting down the family heritage. So what I see that I think is so helpful for me to think about is I see in Naomi a perseverance. I see a woman willing to take what life has thrown at her and do her best to do the right thing and make the right choices, knowing that tragedy is all around her. Her husband has died. Both of her sons have died. She's living in a foreign land, and if God doesn't intervene, she's going to probably starve. But she perseveres anyway. She makes decisions thinking of her daughter-in-law say, hey, don't go with me. You can see things don't go well when I'm around. But instead, she does the right thing time and time again. So what about Boaz? Boaz is an interesting guy, and I think you certainly have to look. This is one of those things in the Old Testament that you just love when you meet some of these characters in the Old Testament, is that these are real men and women that lived real lives, but they also become a foreshadowing of Christ himself. I think we see that in Boaz, who is now the kinsman redeemer, and of certainly the parallel is Christ as your and I's redeemer. Those parallels, those responsibilities are very, very similar. But I see four things in Boaz that are very motivating to me personally. First of all, I see in him obedience. His obedience to the ways of the Lord. Because here's this wealthy landowner, and many people will maintain their wealth out of an attitude and a heart of scarcity. Like, I've been blessed, I have things, and the way I'm going to keep my things is by not giving my things away. Well, he doesn't do that. And the reason he doesn't do that is because the law would not allow it. In Leviticus 19, it says this, when you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God. So this was what was required, but we know that the law was not always followed, right? So what I see in Boaz is a man that was obedient to the law, a man that was willing to do the hard thing. We call this the principle of gleaning. This is a really important principle for us here at the Village Church. It really is what drives us as we have shaped the direction of the work of Joshua's place, this principle of gleaning, because what gleaning did, Boaz could have taken everything that Ruth had, put it in a pile, and had it delivered to her, at an arm's length. But what did he do? He allows her to have the dignity of work. He provided her the respect of being a person that could participate in her own sustenance. We think this is really important. And in fact, the work of Joshua's place is built. One of our foundations is on this principle of gleaning. We want to make sure that we provide those that are struggling with the effects of poverty with resources, but we also give them the ability to participate. So in our food cooperative, it's membership-based. They get about $60 worth of groceries twice a month, but they also meet with somebody. They also take classes on parenting, financial literacy, health and wellness. We want them to be involved. They pay $5 every time they come to get that $60 in groceries. We think that's healthy. Not because that $5 is going to change that much. It does help. It pays for other people to be members. But because we respect people. We believe there's dignity in participation. I believe the law that God gives Israel that Boaz was following is as relevant today on those sorts of things as it was when it was handed to Moses. I also see, beyond obedience, in Boaz a kindness. But Boaz was a kind man. He had an eye for the vulnerable. Again, he goes and engages Ruth. He could have done everything that he did at arm's length, but instead he goes to her and he affirms her. He communicates personally his admiration for her and recognizes that her foreign birth was going to be a special problem. I think that comes from his lived experience. What I haven't shared with you yet that connects you back, remember in the book of Joshua, the story of when the Israelites went into Jericho, the two spies went in to spy out the land. There was a prostitute named Rahab. Rahab then gave them cover, and that the commitment was, because you've helped us, we'll save you and your family. They went in, Jericho, the walls fell down, they took over the city. Rahab and her family were the only ones that survived. Well, Rahab survives and goes on to marry a man named Salmon, another Jew. They had a son, his name was Boaz. Boaz is the son of the Jericho prostitute. My guess is he would have certainly had the influence of a mom that had been married into a community that had accepted her despite her foreign birth, despite her contrary religion, and it accepted her anyway. And I believe his lived experience would lend him more towards kindness than someone that had not had that kind of parent and that kind of upbringing. So I think his kindness was something that is a result of the experience that probably his mother, Rahab, who had been a prostitute, had experienced. The third thing, besides obedience and kindness, is that we see that Boaz acted. Not only does he take action to go and engage Ruth, he gets up the next morning and goes solves the problem. I think if Boaz was part of the village church, he'd have the t-shirt on that John's wearing that says on the back, "Talk is cheap." We got to do something. Compassion is just a feeling. I've got to do something with this. And so Boaz was a man of action when he had the option to not take action, and sometimes he could have deferred it. He could have said to that other kinsman redeemer, "Hey, I'm sorry," he said no. He's responsible, so because he said no, you're kind of out of luck, but he's not. Boaz was a man of obedience and kindness and action. And then finally, I think this one sounds even more, it's more obvious, he was generous. He was a man who was willing to give out of his abundance and what God has blessed him with and give to those around him, not just those in his immediate family, not just those that he were employed, but people that would potentially have no benefit at all. In fact, when he buys back this land, it's not land, it's his. It's now the family of who he bought it back for. He's literally giving away these resources to help other people. I think that makes Boaz a pretty admirable guy. I think you can see why then we would compare him in terms of the things he did and see him as a foreshadowing of Jesus. And I'll just, full revelation here, he's a hero of mine. But Boaz is someone that I have looked at for the past 20 years and have admired. And frankly, I pattern my life after Boaz. I think Boaz is the kind of guy you can look at and say, the way he did it, I want to do it. In fact, my company is called the Boaz Company of Ohio. It's a constant reminder for me for what I see in the book of Ruth and the kind of man he did and his obedience and his kindness and his action and his generosity are all things that I want. If you guys are here when my body's laying in front of this stage, I hope those 4 words are spoken of me. Those are the things that I think we should all aspire to. Boaz is a picture of leadership that I think that we should all consider. Because, we know it. What I love about the Scriptures is it does a great job of telling the fullness of people. We know that David was a great leader, but had some problems. Moses, great leader, had some problems. Boaz, I'm sure he had problems, but in the whole of Boaz's life, he got it right. He was really, really good at leading and caring and providing for people. I think that makes him a hero. So that's Naomi, that's Boaz. Well, what can we learn from Ruth? Well, I think the obvious thing there that we can learn from Ruth is loyalty. Her loyalty to Naomi. And, I think it's understandable when families have a loyalty to each other, especially when there's generational loyalty. But she didn't have that. This was a new family to her. Her loyalty literally cost her and could have cost her life, but she actually was willing to do it anyway. And not just her loyalty to Naomi, but her loyalty to Yahweh, to God, to saying, your people are my people, literally to death. Where you're buried, I'm going to be buried. That's commitment. That's loyalty. One of the things I love, I've told you the backstory of Boaz. Let me carry it a little bit forward that makes this story even more interesting, is that Ruth, because of her obedience, her willingness, what she was willing to put herself in front of, she becomes part of all of our story today. All of us she is due credit and gratefulness from us, because let me read to you in Boaz 4:13. This is the ending of the story. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. He made love to her. The Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The woman said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who was better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." Listen to this. Then Naomi took the children in her arms and cared for him. The woman living there said, "Naomi has a son." And they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. Ruth not only comes in the lineage of David, but if you turn to Matthew 1 right now, as Matthew lists the lineage of Jesus, you see Rahab's name. You see Ruth's name. So this Moabite woman, this foreigner, this outsider that with such loyalty and courage, who risked everything for her mother-in-law, now becomes part of one of the most beautiful stories that's ever been told, as she is one to be in the lineage of Jesus himself. I think that's a pretty special thing. I think that's a pretty incredible lineage for her to have. And I think it's also, for us, a good reminder that Ruth maintained up until that point her position as a foreigner and an outsider. So she did all of this with a high level of vulnerability. So if any of you have ever felt like you're on the outside, any of you felt like you didn't belong, if you felt like you were foreign to something, I think Ruth is someone we can pull a lesson from as a real encouragement. So what is the why? Well, like every book in the Bible, that you can answer that 10 or 12 different ways, maybe even more. We try to just come up with one. What I've gotten this week as I've studied and recalled the book of Ruth is that I see that there's a contrast here of faithfulness and unfaithfulness. I think this story is right for us to say, what happens when people are unfaithful, and what does it look like when people are unfaithful? When you contrast Elimelech, his willingness to leave when the famine hit, and you contrast that to Boaz, the kinsman redeemer, the one that picked up and left when things got tough, and the one who was there to redeem that, and his sons that then would go on to follow their father's habit. Because here's the thing I'd want you to remember. Because remember, what started all of this was a famine. Tough times. Something bad happened. And so at some level, we can look at Elimelech's decision and say, I get it. Things were bad. It's important for you to, when things get bad, to get creative, to do something different. But I want to remind you that same famine that he saw, Boaz saw. But Boaz was there for that same famine, and you see the difference between how they responded to it, and you see the difference between how their lives ended up, where one literally had to become the redeemer through God's grace of the one who cut bait and left versus the one who stayed when things got tough. I think this is an important reminder for us about what I consider to be something that is almost a law in terms of how you see God work his ways, not just in the Old Testament, but in the kingdom in general, is that God will use the available to redeem the unfaithfulness of the responsible. Let me say it again. God will use the available to redeem the unfaithful of the responsible. What do I mean by that? Throughout this story, there were men that were responsible. There were those that had the requirement of them to protect and provide, to be the ones that were blessings, but instead they chose other ways. But despite that, because I'm guessing here, and I'll count myself, there have been times when I've been responsible and I was unfaithful. My guess is some of you probably look at your life and say there's been times when I was responsible, but I've shirked that responsibility and I've been unfaithful. But what I love about this story of Ruth and Boaz is that God uses those that are just simply available. Ruth had nothing to offer, really, but her availability. She was there. She was willing. If you think about Boaz, he wasn't responsible. He had it out, but he was available. I think this is such an important lesson for you and I to work through. First, let me do a little bit of a little side tangent here, because I never want to miss an opportunity to talk about tomcats. I think this is a major problem in our culture, that those who are responsible shirk the duties of responsibility, and then it's placed back on those who are available. We have the number of single moms that are in this church or that we serve at this church as a result of an irresponsible father, as an irresponsible husband, is through the roof. God's grace has provided that we get to be part of that solution and help for them, but it starts with someone not doing what God called them to do. I believe this is something that God grieves over. And I believe as we talk about, I opened up this message talking about heritage. I believe it's something that our heritage ought to provide. It's something that was taught to me by my father. It's something that I've taught to my son, and I know that my children will teach their children. That is the passage, not just of faith, but of how we care for each other, how we love each other. And when that breaks down, there has to be those of us that are available to jump in and say, wait a minute, that's not the end of your story. Your story does not end with one irresponsible person. Why? Because you have a God that is responsible for it all. You have a God that is a God of grace that will not only provide for you supernaturally, but He will provide a community to wrap around you to remind you of the goodness in you, the courage in you, the loyalty in you that we see in Ruth, and then walk alongside you as you go through that day-to-day drudgery and difficulty of what it means to be alone when it was never intended to be that way. I want you to know that if that's you, we see you, and it is why this church is here. It's why we exist. It is why we have the ministry of Celebrate Recovery, and why we have the ministry of Joshua's Place, and why the church exists, because we're your family. We're now your family. We have a responsibility, and we're going to stay available at a matter of constitution, because we think talk is cheap and that love is a verb, and so we're going to maintain ourselves as available. And for those of you that are part of that disruption, I talk about this often, but I think you just cannot talk about it enough, is that many of you are your first generation. You're the first one to stop it. You're the first one to beat alcoholism. You're the first one to beat drug addiction. You're the first one to walk into a community of faith. And it is your desire that you would pass that on. And so you need a community of believers around you, because life is still tough. But I believe God has given special favor to you as you disrupt those unhealthy patterns, is that we as a church and the Holy Spirit as a supernatural presence is here to provide for that change in trajectory. So today, as we wrap up on this book of Ruth and really admire the heroes, I would say certainly Ruth and Boaz both, I want to end with us specifically praying for those that are here this morning, those that are listening, that really know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about generational change, because I believe God has a special work for you. Let's pray together. Heavenly Father, thank you for your word. Thank you for Ruth. Thank you for Boaz. Thank you for the story that is more than just interesting, Lord, but it is moving. Lord, that we see in this story your grace and your mercy and your provision. But God, we also see a leading. We see a guidance here. And so for us at the Village Church, as we started this church to be a place of refuge that would reach those that need those that are available, God, keep us available. Continue to pour your resources into this church, into these ministries, that we would continue to be the hands and feet in Jesus in the lives of those that need it. And God, for those that are here right now that are part of that disruption, they're part of that first generation of Christian faith or of sobriety or of relational health, I pray that you would give them special favor this week and special favor in the season of their life, God, that what you've provided for them would be seen and known for generations. We ask all of this in Jesus' name. Amen.